Welcome to season 2 of Giving Back is Dead. We want to thank first Julian Friedman, who's created this incredible place of off-screen with these series of large-scale installations. I think everybody, we are in the third day of off-screen, and it's had incredible response in Paris. And I think his vision is really, I hope everybody gets to see it. We also would like to thank our sponsor, The Island. As Vajra said, The Island is working to bridge the gap between the tech and art world. And in particular, one of their activities is to produce on-chain art with established artists. And one of their first works that they've produced is just upstairs, and I hope all of you will see it, by Stefan Bergman. It's particularly relevant because it's about the news and about today. And of course, we're living this incredibly difficult time. So, Aindrea, I'm very happy to talk to you today.
Me too.
Mostly what I've been doing is I've been asking people what is giving to the arts and in what way do they consider themselves giving to the arts. And I think today, if you don't mind, that I'm going to answer it for you. As we said before, because particularly why I wanted you to come on Giving Back is Dead is I think giving is more than just giving money. And I think too much people have talked about giving as giving money. And I think you are this incredible example of a different way of giving, which is giving in terms of, donc, you are an art historian, a curator, and a writer. And you have used these skills to do something essentially that's important in all of our communities, I believe, and that's an act of giving. And what I assume, knowing you a little bit, is you've had lots of opportunities to make money in the commercial side of the art world. And I think it's often difficult to resist. And I'm sure, my guess is some art gallery has said to you, Aindrea, don't you want to make $1 million? You know, and you've resisted that, and you've done what you've done, which is important work.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about the art world is when you're introducing yourself to someone and you say you work in the arts, the assumption is you work as a gallerist, or maybe that you work in an auction house. I came from a family that didn't really understand what I wanted to do. I always knew I wanted to be an art historian and a curator, but I think the way that things are set up, especially from traditional African parents, is that you want to go into a vocation that makes a lot of money, or at least is a very secure job. And something like a gallerist, at least, or an auction house, you can kind of see what the setup is. You know how it works, you know how you sort of, build up and like traverse the hierarchies. But I think what always interested me wasn't sort of following this step-by-step route and sort of like moving along and like reaching these goals in a sort of monetary way. I think that the way that I measure success, or the way I measure success is very much outside of myself. I think that it's quite interesting to think about what people are learning or what I am sort of able to bring to the table in a different way. And I think that sometimes, I guess, the art world, or I think sometimes the art world is seen as quite a self-centric activity, but there's actually so much like knowledge production and creative thinking that can give back, as you say, to our art world, but also give back to the world itself. I mean, I'm always very utopic about these things, but I think that if art has the power to change the world, then, choosing paths in that art world that can sort of push that mission forward is always going to be more exciting to me.
And so what do you think about this? The art world is so dominated by, everything is written about the price of a piece of art, and the price for which it's sold. What do you think about that?
I think a lot about that, and I think it's important for all of the art world, but I think it's incredibly interesting when you think about African art as well, because I think what I find most frustrating is that people are really excited about African art, and they usually, when they start with these conversations, they engage with, oh, this person started selling for this amount, as if that is a value system. And in some ways...
And the only criteria.
Exactly. And it's a very embedded thing in the art world itself, but I find that it's particularly rife in this sort of African art, African diaspora conversation, because it links very closely with the idea that this is a new type of art, when there's obviously been decades and decades of art making in Africa. So it's almost as if this, this money amount is also aligned with this introduction of something new and exciting, and look, this new thing is now very expensive, when actually there's a whole wealth of like modernist art, for example, that isn't reaching these auction records, but in some ways is maybe more useful and deserves more attention, so that we can understand like the wider legacy of what African art, or I guess global art is, because we're missing so many sort of pockets by just looking at, the numbers, because the numbers are often associated to the hyper contemporary.
So why don't we talk a little bit about that? So you are currently curator of the Nigerian pavilion that will open in April,
yes,
next April in Venice. And in conjunction with that, you're curator of modern contemporary art at the New Museum of West African Art. And essentially, if I understand, this is your curatorial vision. Can you talk about that?
I think what's really exciting about being a curator at MOA, Museum of West African Art, is there's such like a wide sort of playing field of opportunity. As I was saying, with contemporary, there's a lot of contextualization that I think needs to be done, like a lot of academia, a lot of, real research and thinking, but that's very much tied to this sort of wider sense of what we understand as African art. And I think that looking and focusing on the periods before, like our modernist period, which is very much sort of focused around like maybe the 40s, 50s onwards, thinking about what it means like post-independence for a lot of these African countries, will really allow for like a greater, I hope, understanding that this is not just like a anomaly or like a sort of microcosm. It's part of a really wider story. And I think in some ways I also find it quite interesting when I hear from other people that are really fascinated about this sort of modernist period, that people find, they think that it's something newly discovered, when obviously it's always been there. Because I think it just connects again with this idea that the art world has always sort of thought very much in their own sort of little pockets. Yeah. And I think thinking about, so if you take like the Harlem Renaissance, for example, thinking about what else was going on in the entire world at that time and how it fits in a wider global context is obviously it's more interesting, but it's also more authentic, because I think that we all often think about little movements as like, dotting around and not in connection with each other, when in truth, a lot of artists, a lot of writers were very connected. Like there were African modernists that were talking to some of the Harlem Renaissance artists. There were, connection between negritude in both places. And so I think what would be really interesting is sort of using this research that I'm generating about Nigerian modernism first, and then trying to figure out how that how that links with a global context.
So you're actually generating this research on Nigerian modernism yourself. So it doesn't really exist today. Is it taught anywhere? Is it taught in major universities?
It is taught in some universities. There's a professor, Chika Okeke-Agulu at Princeton. He's like one of the stars of this movement. He's written lots and lots of books on this, but it's not something that's widely practiced. And I think that's what's really exciting about MOA, is that we can be at the center of knowledge production. We need to bring more and more curators and academics to focus on this. It can't just be a small group of people. I think it's something that will expand, and then that's how this academia grows. Like we need to train people, and we need to bring people into this field so that it's sustained. Because if you think about all the other art historical movements, there's countless sort of schools and curators and academics that are focusing on that. I went to the Courtauld. That wasn't offered to me. I spent a lot of my time, focusing on Western modernism, writing lots of essays about the Renaissance, contributing essays to a wide sort of, there's like a huge sort of mountain of essays about Renaissance art. Yeah. Like they didn't need me to keep doing that. And I think that's kind of part of that, I guess, thing about giving back. It's like, I I love all art. I love every single thing. Like I focused on Caravaggio. I actually did a major on medieval art. But when I think about what my mission is and where I can give back, I think that, thinking about where I guess my perspective as a Nigerian, as an African, how I can sort of, I guess, use my identity and my history to connect with another history and be part of what I hope will be a very big movement to really push that history forward. So thinking about not, I guess, what I should do or what I've been formed to do, but what I think is necessary to do.
But I think this is something that is coming really from you and
Yeah.
you. This is what giving back is about, I think.
Yeah, and it's also just, it's very emotionally meaningful to be, doing something that's very connected to one's identity and to see real impact. I mean, I've curated lots of shows in the UK and in Europe, and that's all very exciting, in the US as well. But having the opportunity to really build something that will impact, the larger way that we see ourselves in Africa, training, giving economic opportunities, and really sort of helping to create a place that can really drive knowledge and understanding is going to have such great impacts, probably more than any show I'll ever do in the West. So I'm quite excited.
So in your concept of basically putting the contemporary art scene in a historical context is something that is common in the Western art canon.
Yeah.
So why do you think that had not happened with African art? I mean, it's really a well-proven concept.
I think that there's a lot of different things tied into that. I think that we're only just starting to wrangle with this restitution debate as well. And so a lot of African art for a long time has been trapped in this sort of ethnological scope. And, as that sort of moves out, as things are returned, as we start to really face that head on, I think that sort of interaction between African art and contemporary African art or modern African art can start to really move with full force. I think it's such a shame that, the ways that I've seen some of our, I guess, historic African art treasures have always been in sort of like dark basements at different museums and sort of really, trapped into a narrative that isn't really often about the excellence of the art. It's often about, how it was taken, and how do we start thinking about African art objects, and how do we also start thinking about how they're displayed in a way that is afforded to other sort of schemes of art. Like how do we display maybe a Benin bronze, like a Rodin exhibition? Like how do we look at things in a different way? And I think that will start to be more meaningful as well, because often the way that we talk about African art is linked with ideas of colonialism or oppression, and those are very, important narratives. But there's a lot of other narratives that I think are really exciting and allow us to understand more about, ourselves as humanity.
It seems to me that the Benin bronzes have always been treated a little bit differently. Am I wrong?
Yeah, the way that you see the Benin bronzes traditionally has been in this sort of ethnological display, and the texts would be about the Benin expedition, or they'll be about how they were looted, or they'll be about the Manillas and how that sort of links to the slave trade and all of these things. Really important narratives. But if you type Benin bronze now into Google, you just see articles about the repatriation or about the restitution, a really important a really important part of their history. But I think we need to also, and I think in the future, start thinking about them as, as beautiful historic objects, thinking about the way that they were used, really, I guess, not divorcing from that narrative, but bringing up the other narrative, because otherwise they will always be shrouded or, I guess, trapped in this history that is largely of the West's making. It feels like it's a doubling or a re-looting by having it only trapped into that scheme of thinking.
Did you by any chance see the opening exhibit of the El Thani collection?
I have not yet.
And it happened about 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And in the, it's basically, it's a very small space, and they're showing masterpieces. So he has an incredible collection. And of those masterpieces that he's collected, he shows just a small amount. And in the first little room that you arrived to, which was like a gold box, they had one, and there must have been, maybe there were 5 works of art, maybe 6. And one of them was a Benin head in ivory, which was something, I guess, very rare. It was an empress. That must be something very rare.
I think it's the Idia mask, maybe. There's only 4 of them. There's one in the British Museum. I think the Altanis have one. Yeah, I think it must have been
so
that.
there it was treated as great work of human art. It wasn't, it was treated exactly, in that context. It was unbelievable.
I think that type of context is really exciting. I can't remember because I don't remember the RA show about the Bronze Age that happened a couple of years ago, but if it had ebony and bronze in it, I think that sort of like equalizing and wider context about how do we look at objects, not just in these sort of small narratives, is the way that I think we should be moving forward with African art. And I also think it's quite interesting that where African or historical African art has been contextualized by modern or contemporary, it's often been with artists like Picasso or the people that were looking back, which I kind of, in my mind, reinforces that sort of, I don't know, like extraction of ideas. And I think that what would be more interesting, and I'm sure that I'm starting to see this, and I think this is coming with fuller speed, is thinking about how contemporary or modern African art sort of really relates to the historic as well. So trying to figure out how we create this real legacy and how it's not just sort of seen as disparate moments of greatness, rather than thinking about how, how these movements have moved in a line and how it's, one has informed the other, because a lot of these artists always have been looking back, as artists do, and I think that finding that real thread will be a much more interesting way of understanding African art in the future.
Absolutely, I'm sure you're on the right path. I wanted to look at 3 things that you've done recently that I think also underline giving back to the community and the world at large. One of it, could you talk a little bit about Black Venus? This exhibition that you curated this summer at Somerset House. It's called Reclaiming Black Women in Visual Culture. That show was really, really meaningful to me, and it actually is a good example of something that, obviously really comes from my identity, but also comes from looking around and seeing what is lacking and trying to fill that gap, or trying to figure out where I can sort of give back or sort of provide value, or really address like a gap in history. So a lot of that sort of thinking and this research started when I was at the Courtauld, and I was trying to think about where Blackness lives in art history, in the art history that I was being taught, where Black womanness lives in the art history that I was being taught. The answer is it wasn't there, and I had to look for it myself. And as I started that research, as I started looking into the different artists that were working in the 80s or in different points of history, reading more about the Hottentot Venus, finding disparate journals and writings from great artists and academics like Lorena Grady and Carrie Weems, it all started to come together, and I started to realize there haven't been many exhibitions like this before. So I think what was really meaningful about that exhibition is thinking about, I guess, how my art historical research can give value, obviously, I guess, in a sort of scholarly way, but also how it can really bring, I guess, a sense of community and a sense of place to people. What I love more about that show, I mean, I was very humbled to get such really great reviews on it, but I think in some ways the greatest review were all the sort of TikToks and Instagrams and DMs I was getting from young Black women who were saying they've never been to an exhibition like this, they rarely go to exhibitions, they don't really feel at home in museums or in galleries, but they went with their girlfriends and they looked around and they're like, wow, we've really been here. We have artists that we can look up to. These artists have been fighting that fight for a while. And I think that getting that response in some ways was way, like it eclipsed all of the sort of, great,
I guess, academic sort of kudos, because I guess it also just shows this idea that I mentioned in the beginning about how art is obviously really important for, thinking about history and like the aesthetics and how it fits into like a way that, we understand, sophisticated movements and lines and all that things. But I think it can also just really bring a sense of hope and a sense of belonging. And I think that if you think about, I guess every different curator has a different path, but I think I like to think about social practice very much at the heart of what I want to do. And I try to think about the communities that are involved and how it can really, how art can be more relevant to more people more often. And I think that show hopefully was an example that, we can do things like that, that have that academia, that art world sort of, format, but also can bring people in and take them on a journey.
So you see the whole idea of giving back is dead is be able to find a path by which we can continue to engage next generation to giving in the arts. And one of the themes that I found already, I think we've done about 24 of these conversations, is social impact as being an important element. The next generations want social impact in what and they feel engaged when there's social impact. That's why I was particularly interested in the book that you published in 2021, which is called A Brief History of Protest Art. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about that, because that also was not only about Black artists, that was looking in more. So could you talk a little bit about and why you did that book?
It's funny because I think everyone had their little lockdown project. I did do the traditional things like banana breads and sourdough, but I also wrote a book.
Why did they look down on it?
Huh?
Why did they look, you said they looked down on the project?
No, a lockdown project, during
lockdown
lockdown.
Project. A lockdown project.
So people made banana bread, they made sourdough. I did both of those things. I also did this book. And I mean, it really relates to this period as well, because I think when we were all trapped in our homes, a lot of things were happening. We were seeing, it kind of coincided with this resurgence of BLM, of Black Lives Matter, but also brought to the fore a lot of discussion that I think we've been putting off as humanity for a while. We started to talk more about, climate change. We started to talk more about, equality. Like a lot of things really rose to the surface in a way that either we weren't paying attention and it was always there, I think it is that too, but it just became such a boiling pot that it was no longer possible to try to look away, even if it was more comfortable to do so. And there was a really interesting moment where the art world I think the art world had a little bit of identity crisis as into what are we supposed to do now? That everything is the world is kind of on fire. And where is our place? And I've always kind of seen museums and institutions, and I guess in some ways the art world, as having, at least in my sort of utopic view, we have a role to play in pushing forward new ways of thinking, and at the very least, interacting with social change in a way that we should give platform to artists to reckon with that. So I started digging a little bit into history and seeing how artists have been reckoning with crisis, how they've used their artworks to protest in different ways, sometimes more subtly. The first image, I think, is Death of Mara, so thinking about how artists have sort of, embedded their social views into what is, still a very beautiful painting, all the way to artists like Yoko Ono literally staging protests in New York, and then, peppering it with, beautiful works like Oliver Eliason's sort of practice that really embedded in climate change. So I really tried to make a global book. It traverses, UK, Europe, the States, Asia, Africa, most places, but also trying to look at all the different movements. And what's interesting in the way that book runs, because it's 100 artworks, is that there's a real condensed moment in, like, I guess the last 4 decades. Obviously, protest has always been around, but it became, there's like a rising it's kind of rises and condenses at a point. And obviously a part of that is the artworks I select, but also I think it does align with the way that I think we're moving as a society and the way that artists, I guess, shift their role into being, motivators of change. And I think whenever I speak to an artist, and obviously there's not all artists, but most artists feel that they have, they have some sort of, not duty, but I guess compulsion to embed some view of their own, of the world in their practice. And sometimes it's very overt, sometimes it's very considered, sometimes it's more subtle in less obvious ways. Sometimes it's not in their practice, sometimes it's in other initiatives they do on the side. But I think it was just very interesting to understand, how art has a role or has interacted with ideas of protest in the past, especially when these museums, and we're still going through this, have been in this sort of state of unknowing what to do and how to participate in this social change. And as governments try to, pressure museums not to be so active in that movement.
What about what Nan Goldin did with the Sacklers? What do you think about that?
I don't think Nan Goldin was in the book. I think that
it was a whole long movement. I don't think it can be. It can't be one image.
It wasn't one image. I think I mentioned it very strongly in the opening essay. Yeah. I think Nan Goldin's work is another just really good example of someone that really embeds an enduring view into her practice, and it comes out in so many different ways. And I think when an artist like Nan focuses on something that maybe isn't like, I think I'm trying to understand this more myself. I think there's something very selfless and very important in the way that she made her work.
Absolutely.
Because it's, in some ways, it would have closed a few doors probably. And so, but she was committed to that change and committed to that view. And I think, not every artist can do that, but I think if they can, then I think that it's an incredible thing.
She was ready to give up everything.
Yeah.
To
just push this forward.
For me, that's really this incredible example, because now museums can no longer not think about the origin of donors' wealth.
Yeah.
And it's really,
that's now been a massive moment in the last couple of years.
She's really used her power as an important artist to be able to change how museums look upon their donors now.
Yeah. I mean, and I would be interested to have conversations with directors that have been working for at least a couple of decades, because the shift in narrative about discussing these things, I mean, in my short career so far, has changed so much. I mean, now people very openly question who is backing this, who is donating to this, does that fit the value of the project? And I think that, these sort of open conversations are quite normal now, but I'm almost certain that these were not normal or regular conversations, like even as soon as I'm sure like a couple of decades ago.
There's still, I find, each time when I come back, I live between the United States and France, and each time when I come back to Europe, I am surprised that there is a stronger resistance to all of these themes. Do you see that as well?
In Europe?
Yes.
I think it's growing a little bit. I mean, I've always thought that America likes to talk more about politics than the UK does. I think that's probably a problem. I think that the UK can sometimes be, a bit, I think that we don't like to confront uncomfortable things as much as we should. I think that's been displayed in some of the practices or the, policies that were trying to be moved forward in the middle of BLM. There was a policy that it's called Retain and Explain, which is part of this idea of not removing or taking down things. Is kind of in the time when the statues were coming down, objects or artworks that were embedded in narratives about the slave trade were coming to the fore. And the idea, which isn't very nuanced, I mean, my opinion on it is very nuanced, but the blanket retain and explain without looking, I think, is something that just kind of demonstrates the idea of let's just not think about it. Let's just, let things go on. It's fine. And I think that confronting difficult truths is the way that we move on. And I think it doesn't always have to be a blame game. I think just saying these things were uncomfortable and these bad things happened, acknowledging and discussing is progress.
That's what we saw Germany did. After the war.
And they did very well with that.
I think they give the blueprint of that.
Exactly.
So that leads us into the last thing that I want to discuss with you, which is that you're on a Mayor of London's Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm.
Yeah. It's a long name.
I'm going to read with it so I don't get this wrong. It's called, The Commission's role is to enrich and add to the current public realm and advise on better ways to raise public understanding behind existing statues, street names, building names, and memorials. It sounds great to me. Is it? What is that? What's happening?
It's kind of part of what I was just talking about. So the commission is a mixture of different, there's social historians, there's museum directors, curators, etc.
So you're not alone.
No, there's a couple of, I think there's about 10 of us now. But what our role has been over the last couple of years is to look at, the state of things, look at the public art or the monuments that are already up, but really mostly focus on new commissions. I think that the States is really quite good at, commissioning new public artworks. I mean, the High Line, the public works that you see in New York, I think is a great example of, really bringing new art into the fore that questions these things. London has some great initiatives over the past. We have the Fourth Plinth, and we've had many different iterant projects around London. But what we've been looking to do is to commission artworks that address some of these histories. So we had the Windrush Commission, which looked at the Windrush. We commissioned Thomas J. Price and Veronica Ryan to do those artworks, and then we have a number of upcoming memorials and public artworks that will address different historic points that are, I think, important to tell a story about London that's diverse, because you wouldn't necessarily know that if you looked around London now. You see a lot of statues of, Winston Churchill and yada yada yada, governors that no one's remembered the name of. But I think that bringing that history to the fore will be really, really good, because the statistics for London is so diverse. I think it's 3 out of 5 Londoners were not born in the UK. So that is a big, diverse community with lots of different people. And I think looking at how a city reflects that will be really, really interesting.
Because today it's not terribly reflected in terms of its public art.
Not at all. There was a stat that I think there were more statues of mythical creatures than there were of women. I think we have a couple of women. There's a lot of mermaids and things like that. And horses and whatever, but there's not, there's barely any women. We have Mary Seacole. There's not a lot of monuments or statues that are dedicated to Black people or people of any race for that matter.
It's interesting for a major colonial power which has this heavy history and which is really one of the reasons why London is so diverse.
Yes.
Is it's linked to its empire.
Yeah.
And so that's really not at all obvious. And do you think that, how does the commission function? Do you think you're hopeful this will have impact?
Yeah, I mean, as soon as the next year, a lot of these things take a lot of time to really, create these focus groups, work with the communities, understand which things to focus on, because, we're literally looking at all of history at this point and trying to find points to venerate and to focus on. But in the next year, or even, the next 2 years, there'll be quite a few new commissions that really will showcase that. So there's a few announcements coming out, I think in the next month, about the plan. And there's one in particular that I'm really excited about that I've been more focused on, but I can't say anything.
So basically you're optimistic about this commission. And there isn't anything like this in New York or Los Angeles, is there?
There's not, but I think New York and Los Angeles have been just quite good at getting public sculpture there anyway. I think about Kehinde Wiley's Rumors of War that was in New York, and I think about, the Brick House by Simone Lee and Sanford Biggers. You see a lot of really interesting contemporary art sculptures pop up, even if they're not permanent. And I think having more things like that, I think would only just better the fabric of understanding and allow communities to really, resonate with these histories and be more curious. I would imagine that, Kinde Wale's Rumors of War was, he put a black man on a horse in like the style of these equestrian statues, and it was, I didn't get to see it in real life, but it does feature in the protest art book. But seeing that every day, seeing like a black man on a hoodie on a horse, really allows you to question a lot of things. It allows you to question, how many, how many black men you see in public sculpture. It allows you to understand these fabrics of who is positioned in these, in these ways. Usually it's Napoleon or some sort of, or these, kings or gentry, etc. And I think it allows us to, question, how we see certain communities, certain people, how they can be, how they can sit in these positions and destabilize some very, very deep-rooted stereotypes.
I suppose my last question is, what do you think about legacy institutions? For your community, are legacy institutions relevant?
Can you explain legacy institutions more?
Like the British Museum. The major museums in the world, are they still relevant to today's life for your community?
It's hard. Are they still relevant? It's a difficult one because in some ways I feel that it's great that we can see treasures of the world. I understand that as a basis, but I think it's deeply complicated when it's linked to, these, when it's linked to exercises of, you can call it looting or you can call it just sort of accumulation under, unjust means or whatever sort of passage these objects arrive at. There's something quite, sad of seeing them divorced from context. But in the same way, I also think it would be great to have some sort of institutions in Africa or in other parts of the world where they can see the art of the West or the art of the rest of, of different countries. So, to answer the question more directly, I think that these museums will have to go through a process of reconfiguration. Yeah. If I was the director of one of these museums, I think I would focus on creating lots and lots of links with other institutions around the world that linked to their collections and creating sort of, two-way partnerships. So say if you had a great collection of Indian art, I would, be engaging with India to figure out how we can have a two-way circulation of cultural objects, of artworks, so that at least there's a connection. It doesn't just feel like these are all the things I have from these countries. Like how can, if that exercise has been done, how can it then be, how then can we enter into relationships that are mutually beneficial and allow for that mutually beneficial relationship to really give value in a new way? Because otherwise it's just, people in London or in the US that get the benefit of seeing all the world's, greatest artworks and greatest treasures. And that obviously impacts the way that we see the world and we see the possibility for art. I think that really building those connections will allow, for greater meaning and understanding. So if anyone wants to make me the director of a legacy institution, that's what I would do.
I will if I have a chance, I'll nominate you.
I think that'd be kind of cool. But maybe it's too difficult. But that's my utopic view. And maybe there will be a bit of that someday.
Well, Aindrea, thank you so much. As you know, I love talking to you. I hope we continue the discussion. And you're one of my poster persons for the Giving Back is Not Dead.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Be sure to check out our latest podcast and subscribe to Giving Back is Dead.